So, what are your thoughts on the fact that Quaker Oats fed radioactive oatmeal to children? Well, hello there. I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. In 1877, when Quaker Oats registered as the first trademark for a breakfast cereal, the trademark was registered as a figure of a man in Quaker garb. Now, despite what many people used to assume, Quaker Oats was not founded by Quakers at all. They simply chose the Quaker name and logo as a symbol of good quality and honest value, because this is how Quaker Oats wanted to be seen, as a good an honest brand. But were they? The Quaker Oats Company has been around for 146 years, which means they've had a lot of time to be naughty. Over the years, Quaker Oats worked to narrow down their target demographic, and they eventually landed on mothers and children. They started making things that would work as school snacks, like chocolate chip granola bars, and even adding things to their oatmeal to make it more exciting to children. Like, do you guys remember those little dinosaur eggs that would melt to reveal colorful dinosaurs? I don't think I ever had those as a kid, but I have bought those for my children, and I will say they were a huge hit. It didn't really help me to get them to eat their oatmeal, but it did get Quaker Oats a sell. Some people find it surprising when a company that's targeting children does something unethical, but personally I feel like those are usually the worst offenders. Am I right? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Today's story starts with the Walter E. Fernand State School, which was originally named the Massachusetts. I cannot say the name of that state, so you guys can go ahead and laugh. The Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded. The school was an institution for the mentally challenged that operated for nearly a century. The school was created to help house and attempt to educate children that the state had deemed mentally disabled, or children who had been abandoned or orphaned by their parents. Now, if you've ever researched anything about past history having to do with specialized institutions that tried to help understand mental disabilities back in the day, then you probably know that it was not good. Many of the treatments at these types of institutions are things that would be considered abuse nowadays. Some of these practitioners truly were doing what they thought was the best, but looking back, most of us can't even really fathom how someone thought that the things they were doing was ever a good idea, and you kind of just makes you angry. Many of the horrible things done in the past are how we've learned the things that we now know today, which it's still hard to imagine because some of these things just feel like common sense. All of that being said, when was anything that was sponsored by the government ever really turned out to be a good thing? I kind of went down a really deep rabbit hole into this school, and that would have to be its own separate episode. So let's just say that the conditions at the school were pretty terrible, and abuse was the norm for the unfortunate children who were placed there.
I kind of thought for a while maybe there was something wrong with me, or why would I be here?
There was, in fact, nothing wrong with Joe Almeida, but that didn't prevent him from getting swept into the system. He was an abused child, and when he was 8, his father took him for a drive to the Fernald school and told him to wait in the hallway.
I said, wait a minute, Dad, where are you going, you know? He goes, oh, you wait right there. He goes, I gotta go get the car. And he went, and that was the last I seen of him.
Joe had no idea where he was, no idea that he now wore an invisible label which read moron. They spent their mornings in the schoolroom. At least, that's what the room was called.
It was a school in name only. A child would experience the first year of school 5 or 6 times in a row. He would read the same Dick and Jane reader and never make any progress because the school wasn't equipped to actually educate children. It was there as a sort of holding pen.
The children did most of the manual labor at the school.
What kind of work did they do?
The kids at Fernald raised the vegetables that they ate. They sewed the soles on the shoes that they wore. They manufactured the brooms that they used to sweep the floor.
He says the school made sure at least 30% of the kids admitted had normal or near normal intelligence. The school needed those kids to work.
You had to have somebody with a certain level of intelligence in order to run this place.
In effect, you were very cheap labor.
Definitely. And I can remember like being out in the gardens from morning to in the sun.
Joe Almeida says was the abuse he suffered from the attendants who staffed the place.
They had what they call Red Cherry Day, okay? What Red Cherry Day was, they'd sit us all in a circle, and they'd call you up. alphabetically. And lucky me, my name is what?
Almeida.
Almeida. You'd get up in front of all these kids, and you'd pull down your pants, and you'd pull down your underpants, they'd make you turn around, and they'd whack your ass with this branch until it was red like a cherry.
Few of the attendants showed any kindness, he says, but some of them should have been institutionalized themselves.
This Mr. Rozier used to have 3 or 4 kids urinate in a bucket, and she'd have them throw it in your face. I mean, these people were sick that worked here.
These boys were underfed and forced to do manual labor in addition to physical, mental, and even sexual abuse. One of the other things that I found really sad in my research is that a lot of the children there were deemed feeble-minded, or morons, as I used to call them, who had nothing actually wrong with them. But once that was placed on their official records, it actually followed them into adulthood, and it made finding employment difficult for them. In addition to being incarcerated, abused, poorly educated, and malnourished, many of the Fernand residents were unwitting participants in medical experiments such as the science club that was started in 1946. This was put forth as a thing that the boys could volunteer to do, but many of them eagerly joined because they were promised special privileges like trips off campus to see the Boston Red Sox games, as well as they were given things like Mickey Mouse watches and also extra food and milk. What young boy would ever turn down more food, especially when they were being underfed? Some of the boys would later say that they also joined this science club because they were really hoping that the scientists who were coming into the school would see how badly they were treated and do something about it. From 1946 to 1953, researchers from the Quaker Oats Company, MIT, and Harvard University conducted experiments at the Walter E. Ferdinand State School to determine how minerals from the cereals were metabolized in the body. This was the science club. Quaker Oats supplied the cereal while MIT received funding for their research, and the school benefited because they weren't having to pay for any of these amenities. This is what you would call a win-win-win, and at the time, the boys would have probably seen it as a win as well. So a win-win-win-win. The opportunity to leave the school's campus and spend the day doing something other than manual labor was super appealing.
You have to remember, when you've never been left the school, you've never had the privilege of going to a baseball game. You never had that opportunity. So because you never had the opportunity of leaving the grounds, if I came to you and offered you this kind of a package deal, what would you do?
The boys felt like they were special to have this opportunity to join the science club. But of course, what they didn't know was the small detail about the radioactive materials that were in the Quaker Oats brand oatmeal that they were being fed. In 1946, one study exposed 17 subjects to radioactive iron. The second study, which involved a series of 17 related sub-studies, exposed 57 subjects to radioactive calcium between 1950 and 1953. Now, this was before the days of informed consent, so these researchers weren't technically doing anything wrong legally. And of course, these types of experiments from our past are why we have things like informed consent nowadays, which basically informed consent just means it's a legal obligation for researchers to fully inform their test subjects of all the risks involved in choosing to participate in a study. Now, just to clarify, the doses of radioactive material were extremely low, so you might be wondering, were these test subject children actually harmed as a consequence of these studies? We'll come back to that. Now, as part of this whole process, the school did send out 2 consent forms to parents letting them know about their children receiving these special foods, but it didn't mention that the food their children were being fed contained radioactive calcium and iron. As a matter of fact, the consent form didn't mention anything potentially negative about this study, only the positive things. I'm going to link copies of those 2 letters below this episode, but the letters basically refer to a project in which the kids at the school would receive a diet rich in various cereals, irons, and vitamins, and for which it will be necessary to make some blood tests at stated intervals, similar to those in which our patients are already accustomed, and which will cause no discomfort or change in their physical condition other than possibly improvement. The letter makes no mention of any risks or the use of a radioisotope. Parents or guardians of the children were asked to indicate that they had no objection to their son's participation in the project by signing an enclosed form. The second letter sent to the parents basically said that their son had agreed to volunteer for the study and to sign the form if they had no objections to this. It also outlined the special things the boys would get for being a part of the study. And I quote, "We have asked for volunteers to give a sample of blood once a month for 3 months, and your son has agreed to volunteer because the boys who belong to the science club have many additional privileges. They get a quart of milk daily during that time and are taken to a baseball game, to the beach, and to some outside dinners, and they enjoy it greatly. I hope that you have no objection that your son is voluntarily participating in this study. The first study will start on Monday, June 8th, and if you have not expressed any objections, we will assume that your son may participate." Again, there were no mention of any risks or the use of radioisotope. Some of the boys didn't even have parents to send the letters to, but the boys were allowed to sign for themselves, which I can't imagine would have been legally binding even back then. I don't know. I'm not a legal expert. Of course, it was believed then that the risks of these experiments were minimal, as indeed they appear to actually have been, and the school administrators may not have thought it necessary to raise the issue of risks with the parents. But they also kind of implied in both letters that the project was intended to benefit the children, and that part simply wasn't true. These experiments were done for an advertising campaign. That's right. They exposed children to radiation in order to get a leg up on the competition. Apparently, Quaker Oats had previously gotten into some trouble for making claims about their cereals being better for you than the competitor cereals when they had no actual evidence to back up those claims. Scientists at that time were very excited to conduct experiments on human health, and more companies were wanting to have science to back up their claims. Now, there was a second reason for these studies, which I think is the main purpose that the MIT researchers were doing the study for, and that is they wanted to know what kind of effects radioactivity had on the human body. Because at the time, more and more people were being exposed to radiation than ever before, and so they were kind of like, let's see what happens if we feed it to them. This kind of makes me feel like MIT was a little bit more to blame for this than the guys at Quaker Oats. From like an ethical standpoint, I feel like they were the ones who probably knew a bit more of what was going on, and maybe the guys at Quaker Oats were kind of just like, we can do that? Cool. You know, like how much science did they really know they were making cereal? You know, like did they have food scientists back then? The oatmeal experiments were conducted on boys ranging from ages 10 to 17, and one study simply had the boys eat oatmeal with radioactive iron tracers in it. Another experiment had the boys drink milk with radioactive calcium tracers. And for the third experiment, the boys were also given injections of radioactive calcium. The first two experiments allowed researchers to see how iron and calcium were absorbed into the bloodstream, and the third experiment proved that calcium entering the bloodstream goes straight to the bones. The study showed that the ingredients in Quaker Oats oatmeal led to better absorption of iron than the ingredients used in cream of wheat. Quaker Oats now had the data to back up their claims that they were better than cream of wheat. Turns out, testing radioactive versions of their products on poor little orphan children had paid off. Yes! The cereal business was booming, and Quaker Oats sales grew to $277 million, which if you translate that for inflation, means that Quaker Oats sales were over $2.9 billion in today's money. So we're talking big money in that cereal aisle. During the 1940s, consumers considered nutrition as a top priority, and when the Department of Agriculture established its first set of dietary guidelines in 1943, they included oatmeal as a preferred whole grain. Advertisements on TV showcased Quaker Oats as the best start to your kiddo's day.
A hug, a kiss, and a good hot Quaker Oats breakfast. The best school day start you can give your youngster. For just as his soul is nourished by a hug and a kiss, so will his young body be nourished by a good hot breakfast of Quaker Oats. Yes, you'll keep him bright and alert for classwork, happy and healthy through the morning's active play with a nourishing hot breakfast of Quaker Oats with that wonderful oatmeal protein.
These radioactive oatmeal experiments were only a few of countless radiation experiments approved by the Atomic Energy Commission between the years of 1945 and 1962. During these years, over 210,000 American citizens were exposed to radiation without their consent and often without their knowledge. The boys at the Fernald State School didn't even find out the complete truth about the testing that had been done on them until nearly 50 years later, when an investigative reporter, Elaine Wilson, was researching radiation testing by the government. During this time, there was a lot of concern over the nuclear weapons industry. And thanks in part to Elaine's investigation, the Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, declassified several Atomic Energy Commission documents in 1993, and this is when the information about the school was released. The Boston Globe released a report which sparked public outrage and led to several other publications reporting on this issue and urging victims from the state school to come forward. In 1995, 30 former students filed a class action lawsuit against Quaker Oats and MIT. David Lister of MIT stated that the oatmeal experiment only exposed the boys to 170 to 330 millireams of radiation. This is roughly equivalent to 30 consecutive chest x-rays, which is quite a bit of radiation to receive all at once, but it's certainly not enough that you would think it would cause some sort of serious health concern, which is what the spokesperson on behalf of MIT seemed to be arguing. Those condemning MIT and Quaker Oats on the ethical implications of the studies stated that the boys had a 1 in 2,000 chance of contracting cancer after this radiation exposure. But in reality, that's only slightly higher than what is considered the average rate for anyone being exposed, like just in the environment. And it's important to note that the 1994 Massachusetts state panel was unable to find any victims who were suffering from significant health impacts. And they were also able to argue that radioactive tracers were still being used in medicine till that day. In addition to the fact that there was no evidence showing any of the test subjects had been harmed by these experiments, they also had good things that had come out of these studies. The results from this radioactive research had helped scientists to understand calcium metabolism better, and they provided the groundwork for later analysis on osteoporosis, and this ultimately led to an improvement in how doctors treat osteoporosis. The basic argument was that since these tests had helped make advancements in the treatment of other diseases, that it was justified to have unknowing children participants injected with doses of radiation. I guess they were just lucky that no one was hurt, because I'm not sure they even knew what a safe level of radiation exposure was back in those days. Looking back all of these years later, most people would probably feel that feeding mentally disabled children radioactive oatmeal just kind of feels wrong. It just seems a little unethical, especially when you consider the lack of informed consent and the fact that the children were basically prisoners at this school. They were at the complete mercy of whoever happened to be working at the facility at that time. These were the most vulnerable of us, mentally disabled children who didn't really have anyone looking out for their best interest, and all for an advertising campaign. That's probably the worst part. I am glad to know that these children weren't hurt by the radiation exposure they received, but they risked all of that to sell oatmeal. It's important to note that Quaker Oats completely denies that they played a significant role in these experiments. According to a spokesperson for the company, Quaker Oats simply donated the cereal and gave a small research grant to the university. In the 1990s, United States President Bill Clinton issued an apology to the former students of Fernald State School because of the fact that the Atomic Energy Commission had indirectly sponsored the study due to the contract that they had with MIT. While the task force formed in 1994 had determined that none of the victims were physically harmed as a result of the oatmeal experiments, as I mentioned earlier, they did find that the students' civil rights were violated.
All they knew is that they'd been asked to join a science club. One of those who attended the hearing was Joe Almeida, a member of the club. He says the boys were recruited with special treats.
We were getting special treatment, extra dessert. We got to eat away from the other boys. We were getting extra oatmeal, getting extra milk.
They forgot to mention the milk was radioactive.
David Whiteleaf, an attorney who worked on the state task force investigating the science club, says he was outraged that the children were exploited with their knowledge.
It's my contention, and it was my contention on the task force, that these experiments, because of the lack of informed consent, violated the Nuremberg Code, established just 10 years earlier.
The Nuremberg Code. Dr. Mengele and company.
Right. The lesson of Nazi Germany was, we don't do experiments on people without informed consent.
MIT President Charles Vest apologized for the way that the Ferdinand experiments were conducted when reports about them were first published in 1994. And in 1998, a settlement was reached in the class action lawsuit for $1.8 million.
Each received about $60,000 in compensation from MIT, Quaker Oats, and the government. But Fred and Joe never got what they really wanted, an apology for sending them to Fernald and calling them morons, a label that remains on their state records to this day.
You are 63 years old.
63, yeah.
You have never received from the state of Massachusetts or from any agency at all a statement saying that you are not feeble-minded, that they made a mistake.
Absolutely not.
Stays with you. Sorry.
What stays with you the most?
Being a moron. Never getting to know what I could have been.
The experiments in Ferdinand highlighted a dark chapter in medical history where the well-being of vulnerable individuals was sacrificed for scientific curiosity. Unfortunately, this is just one case of many where scientists and the government have conducted some pretty shady human experiments. But luckily, these experiments also played a role in shaping modern ethical guidelines for medical research, emphasizing the importance of informed consent and the protection of vulnerable populations. So, was this truly an experiment that was done simply for marketing purposes? Or did Quaker Oats just give the school some free oatmeal and, by some happy coincidence, get some results that helped them crush their competitors by showing that their cereal was superior? This is History and Hearsay, so that means you get to decide. Is it history? Did Quaker Oats do some questionable things that they now regret and want to forget about? Or is this all a bunch of overhyped hearsay for those trying to sensationalize historical events? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and until next time, I'll catch you right here in the next one. You like my Christmas cup? Walmart. I'm glad to know that these kids weren't hurt by the radiation explosion. They would have been hurt by that, I can guarantee you. Quaker Oaks fed. Quaker Oaks. Why do I keep saying Quaker Oaks? The Massachusetts.